Our next speakers are Darren Brookes, the Director of Assessments, and Beulah Davies, an intelligence analyst here at the CCC. And Darren and Beulah will give an overview of how to identify suspected corrupt conduct, when to report that to the CCC, and the use of intelligence in assessing those complaints. So over to Darren.
Morning, everyone. As Jeff said, I'm Darren Brookes, and I'll be handing over to my colleague Beulah Davies to talk about the intelligence side of stuff. Obviously, this is the main purpose today. You should see the slide in front of you. It is impossible for me to cover everything that really drills down to these very issues in the very short period of time they've got. So just to echo my colleagues as they will through the day, please contact the office should you require anything further in relation to what I do say. The main purpose of the Act is there that's set out. As I should also say, as I go through these slides, I'm not a slide reader. I'm not going to read everything that's on the slide. What I'll endeavour to do in the short period of time is to pick out those salient points for you so you can hopefully know where we sort of focus, or in particular where I focus on a particular issue. As you can see there, it's the main purpose of the Act is that for everyone to make Queensland corruption resistant, is for ourselves and for you to assist us. And so the next thing is, how do we do this? If there's one takeaway that you do take away from my presentation today is corruption in focus. It's available on our website. I suggest when I ever do these presentations that you actually download it onto your desktop or on your Surface Pro if you're lucky enough to have one. And in that way you can refer to it and do word searches if need be. As you can see, as I put on there, it's our Bible. It gives an explanation of all the things there that we're specifically looking for. As you can see, there are a number of issues there that we focus on when we're looking at such matters. How does corrupt conduct come to your attention? Again, there are a number of ways that are indicated there on the slide. I mean, the obvious ones is through a complaint. Member of staff or someone who claims to be a PID may come to you directly. Of course, we get them through the commission, that they come directly to us and make allegations across the board in relation to not only the department itself but also individuals that are there. And of course we get it through our intelligence functionality and our corruption operations, and again Beulah will touch on that partly in her presentation later on. Okay, the assessment of complaints. Before I move on to the next sort of slide after this, it's fair to say it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but no one case is the same. They may have core parts to it that are similar, like procurement or perhaps stealing within the department, but there'll always be some nuance to there. There may well be that people do have delegations and they don't, and so on. So it can be very difficult. So I always say is have an open mind, look at the actual elements of what's occurred and apply them to our legislation. Okay, that sort of segues into each of the key elements. Again, I just do not have the time to go through and break down each of these elements. They're there on this slide. They're obviously in our legislation. But it's fair to say in both Section 15.1, which is the main one that perhaps that you will see, because these are people who are holders of an appointment in a unit of public administration, the acronym being the UPA, and these are the ones that you'll see the majority of. Each element, as I say, must be fulfilled in order for the corrupt conduct allegation to be made out. The difficulty usually is that the lower part of this at C, which is termination of employment or a criminal offence, because not always what people do would be a criminal offence, but of course within your particular department, should they do that, then it would be reasonable grounds for dismissal. 15.2 is slightly different. The only thing I will say about this is that the Commission takes a more narrow interpretation of this particular legislation. It was introduced as regards to an amendment that we lobbied for in relation to changes to our Act. These are the people that sort of are on the periphery and are not holders of an appointment within a UPA. Again, this really, if you look at closely where it's targeted, is really follow the money. So if you've got contractors normally that are outside your agency that are contracted in, usually when you're looking at this in secret commissions, this is the sort of the section that may engage our jurisdiction. The vexed issue here is only notify us when you have a reasonable suspicion. The obvious example here is that you may get a complaint where someone says, everybody in your department's corrupt. That may well be that someone has done something in the past or there is an investigation, but it doesn't actually point to anything specific. So in those cases, we would say you don't have a reasonable suspicion. There may be a suspicion, or it may be just a generic statement by someone who's had some dealings with the department. Again, I'm not going to go through all the parts of reasonable suspicion, but the next few slides will give you an indication of the legislation that the Commission relies upon when we are looking at whether or not there is a reasonable suspicion, again to see whether it engages our jurisdiction. You will see here that I've given some examples or some text from cases that we rely on. Again, particularly in relation to George v. Rocket, that's actually in the Bible, Corruption in Focus. So again, you know, a lot of what I'm saying here, should you be concerned about, well, hang on, what did we say about reasonable suspicion? A simple Boolean search or word search within a PDF document will actually find that for you, and you'll be able to look at it and use that as a guide in when you're assessing the matter. The next slide, again, is this has got to be more than an idle wondering. Again, I joke about this, you know, you go down Speculation Alley and you only find rats and used chip papers. At the end of the day, we don't want to actually speculate on whether someone has done anything. There must be some sort of tangible evidence that we would like you to consider, and you will do that by looking at some of your own holdings and the information being provided. And again, Beulah will touch on some of the stuff that we then do in relation to seeing whether or not we can add any meat to the bones in relation to our intelligence holdings. The important part here is it must be based on an objective assessment of the information at hand. But you don't need to have all of the evidence. That would be unfair on yourselves, and also, as you will see in Corruption in Focus, we ask you not to delve too deep because it may actually interfere with something that we may want to do down the track should we wish to assume responsibility of an investigation. The next slide is really your obligations. Once you do have that reasonable suspicion, you have an obligation to report it to us. One of the things that we do find across the board with all UPAs is they think, oh, well, we'll just hang on and get a little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. As you will see there under Section 39, your obligations to report to us are paramount. Issues in relation to privacy often come up, and as a consequence of that, that again is something that we say, no, your obligation are quite specific there at 39. So if you're unsure, please look up the legislation, and if you have any questions, again, come back to me. Here again is a slide just to give you a bit of guidance. Once you've assessed a matter and referred it to the Commission, the obvious question we get quite a lot in telephone calls to our officers is, what do I do? Here again are some dot points that I suggest you take on board. This is not an exhaustive list. It is just some suggestions that you know, as the Commission we say would actually help you deal with matters while you're awaiting our assessment. We do endeavour to meet our KPIs in relation to responding to you within 30 days, and we are meeting those regularly here, so you will get an explanation within that period of time. Or should I say a breakdown of the assessment and an explanation as to what we say it is, whether it's corrupt conduct or a breach of your code of conduct. Again, the general criteria, this is just to give you a snapshot of what we actually look at. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. I just put it up there as some sort of general pointers for you in this short period of time as to what we consider. You will see there on the box on the right-hand side, they're the possible outcomes. Later on, my colleague Marie Zitney will actually go further into those, but as you can see, this is the likely outcome of many of the assessments that we do. Under our devolution policy, the chances are that in a lot of cases, because we have confidence in you and your organisation, you being the liaison officers, it will be referred back to you on perhaps a referred no further advice basis or subject to our statutory monitoring function. Just very, very briefly, this is how we consider and triage complaints. It is more complex than this slide. Again, I just do not have the time to go into any great details. You will see after they've been filtered, we look at the assessment process, and part of that is we look at our CCC intelligence holdings. And that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me, is a nice little segue into my colleague, Beulah Davis, who will give you a very brief input on how we look at it from an intelligence perspective. Thank you all.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beulah Davies. I'm an intelligence analyst at the Crime and Corruption Commission, and it's my pleasure to be here today to deliver this session on how the CCC uses intelligence information in the assessment of complaints. Now, I can appreciate not every agency tuning in today will have an intelligence capability or function, and that's completely fine. This particular presentation does not require that to be the case. You'll be able to get value out of what I'm presenting regardless. Now, before I go any further, I would like to briefly talk about the definition of intel, as it may be somewhat unfamiliar to some. So in the context of investigations, the term intelligence has been defined and explained in many different ways. On the slide in front of you, you will notice there's two particular definitions that I'd like to highlight. The first largely focuses on intelligence being a process. The second, definition slightly changes the definition of intel, and it's more a result of the process or a product. So what is intelligence? Intel is a process of gathering information and then adding value, usually by analysing the information, in order to achieve a stated purpose or outcome. The information gathered will relate to an activity or suspected activity of interest. So in the context of corruption, this will be a complaint of corrupt conduct. Alternatively, you might notice that intelligence can also refer to the product of that process, so the insights and understanding that is generated from the gathering and analysis of information. It also pays to be aware that there are multiple types of intelligence. One such type is often referred to as tactical intel, and that is where the focus is on providing insight and understanding into a specific complaint matter or investigation. It has got a local focused application, and it's used to inform or direct investigative activity or decision-making of complaints. Another type of way that intelligence is used is for a more strategic purpose, and that is where intel is used to identify and provide insight into trends and emerging risks and provide long-term guidance to decision-making. As you can see, the use of strategic intelligence in a strategic way has more of a preventative focus and a predictive focus, whereas tactical intel is much more an investigative focus. Now, this is on the screen at the moment. There is a very basic flowchart that I've prepared for the purposes of today to illustrate how and where the intelligence capability plugs into the workflow process when assessing a complaint at the CCC. So as you can see, the process is often kicked off with the CCC being notified of a complaint. Now, that can come externally from a UPA or internally generated through our own activities. Of course, the next step will be a triage of this information where the CCC will categorise it and prioritise it according to a number of aspects of the complaint. In CCC terminology, we refer to these as either high, medium or low, and complaints as sorted depending on the severity of the alleged conduct and the impact of the community. As you can see from the flowchart, regardless of how corrupt conduct complaints are categorised, there will always be additional research to help inform decision-making to arrive at an assessment decision. Now, if you can look at the flowchart, you can see that where intel inquiries plug into this process. So at the CCC, we will only direct intel inquiries on matters of high importance and priority. And that, of course, is to make sure that we're allocating resources in a most effective and efficient way. Now, the way additional research and intelligence inquiries are carried out are actually quite different. I don't have time to get into that today, but I can say that the types of sources that are consulted in each of those processes are quite different, and the application of intel inquiries in the assessment of complaints allows the CCC to have a more breadth and depth and more rigour to the assessment process. Some examples of types of inquiries that could be taken out in this stage could be paid subscriptions, such as News Court, which a normal staff member may not have access to. Sometimes our intelligence officers have access to a broader range of agency holdings that might be useful, and also there may be the conduction of extensive online searches such as social media checks. Typically, our intelligence officers have a much more advanced capability around interrogating databases, analysing data, and also identifying pattern and trends. They're also quite skilled at navigating online to minimise their digital footprint and alerting any subject officers of our interest in them. Now again, the goal of conducting intel inquiries and conducting additional research is always to contribute to the decision-making process. Our goal is always to provide decision makers with a greater understanding of the alleged event that is to have occurred, and providing context to that allegation, and also verifying information when we can. Now I would like to take you through a hypothetical example to illustrate how intelligence can enhance the assessment of a complaint by helping to establish whether or not a reasonable suspicion exists. Okay, so remember, Darren touched on this earlier. For a suspicion to be reasonable, there needs to be sufficient information for a reasonable person to suspect corrupt conduct has occurred. This does not mean you need all the information to prove the conduct had occurred. That is what the investigation is for. So let's have a look at this example. In this example, allegations have been made against an executive director employed at a UPA who is alleged to have been involved in the awarding of a contract to a company owned and operated by her associate. She is also alleged to be receiving kickbacks from this particular company. Now in this example, generally we would do basic research to help establish whether or not a reasonable suspicion exists. The typical types of tasks we would do would be reviewing all the information provided in the complaint and any attachments that are included. We'll also do an interrogation of agency holdings and information on our own systems to see if there's any relevant information that can provide insight and help establish whether a reasonable suspicion exists. We can also review complaints history to see if there are any related complaints or if this conduct has been complained about previously. Now, without an intelligence capability, additional inquiries will be limited to those typical inquiries I just listed. However, as you can see from the next slide, with the addition of intelligence inquiries in the assessment process, all of a sudden you can navigate or interrogate more data sources and find more information that may be relevant to the assessment of the complaint. Now, an officer trained in intelligence methodologies and practices will typically be able to identify and locate more information that would normally be accessible at this particular stage in the assessment of a matter. So as a result of the breadth and depth of intel inquiries, more information can be collected, resulting in more insight and understanding around the alleged event or activity. So some basic examples of intelligence inquiries that might be carried out would be open source inquiries. So that would include, I suppose it would be navigating to a number of publicly available data sets, and a typical intelligence officer would have a greater awareness than the normal staff member in terms of what different types of sources are available online. Let's say, for example, in this particular case study, an officer could conduct some online searches and find that the subject officer and the owner of the company may both have an interest in dragon boat racing, as a very random example. From an intelligence point of view, an intelligence perspective, I mean, that could help an intelligence officer identify a particular link between the subject officer and the owner of the company. Interrogation of social media accounts and different platforms might be able to identify that the executive director in the case study and the company operator previously worked together in a different department many years ago. Alternatively, you could even use Facebook to see whether or not those two particular individuals have common associates. All this information collected and collated and analysed, intelligence officers can start to build a picture of whether or not an association may exist between these two particular entities. And of course, in the addition of a lot of information is available online, but there's also paid searches that intel officers can utilise to access very detailed and accurate company and business information to confirm that particular company owner is linked to that business. Now, as you can see through the illustrations on the screen, with the addition of intelligence information, all of a sudden you can get a greater understanding of the broader context of the issue or the conduct. Sometimes those extra pieces of the puzzle, or as Darren referred to it before, the added meat on the bones, can actually help the CCC identify whether or not a reasonable suspicion exists in a particular matter. And I suppose in the context of a UPA, this can also be helpful to identify whether or not a reasonable suspicion exists and whether or not you need to notify the CCC. So it's important to remind you that we don't, this is definitely in the preliminary stages. People who are trained in intelligence methodologies can be very covert around identifying and collecting this information in the covert capacity so as not to raise any suspicion of subject officers that they're being looked into. From a UPA perspective though, of course you would be very mindful around the types of inquiries you would do at this stage. You do not want to compromise anything that might be happening in the future. But it sometimes is important to conduct these types of additional research in order to establish whether or not a reasonable suspicion exists. Now, another thing I'd like to point out is sometimes as puzzle pieces fall into place, instead of finding information to raise a reasonable suspicion, you actually identify contradictory and conflicting information, which may suggest it is doubtful or improbable that the alleged conduct occurred. Sometimes the information that we uncover actually leans more to the suggests that the complaint is potentially frivolous or vexatious in nature. As we identify, there may be nefarious motivations to lodging the complaint in the first place. And this is valuable information for a decision maker because ultimately it helps them ensure that the public resources are directed more towards complaints with substance. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're always aiming for better decision making in complaints management and better allocation of public resources. Now, I want to finish my presentation with an important announcement. Planning is underway at the CCC to develop an Intelligence Fundamentals training course. Now, the intention is that this course will be offered to Queensland Government agencies, including councils who are interested, and it will likely be aimed at officers attached to ethical standards units or involved in the investigation of matters, and also liaison officers. So this initiative has kicked off as a result of feedback received during the recent corruption strategy stakeholder consultation process. So if any of you are out there who have contributed to that process, thank you very much. We've heard you and we are taking action on the insights you've provided. So this course will cover basic fundamentals of intelligence practice and methodologies with a particular focus on upskilling participants to conduct probably open source intelligence gathering activities in a very safe, covert way, and allow you to access or build capability around accessing your awareness to and accessing publicly available information to support the assessment and investigation of corrupt conduct complaints. So before I finish up, I would like to invite you to express your interest in this initiative. Please email me directly and let me know whether or not this is something you think your agency would be interested in accessing. And if you also have any idea on topics or content you would like the course to cover, please feel free to let me know. We will be collating any feedback that we receive, and we will, if we can, make sure that we cover off on those points in our training. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I will now pass you on to Jeff. Thank you.